As the Denver Broncos prepare for their final preseason matchup against the Arizona Cardinals, Zach Wilson and Jarrett Stidham could be fighting for the backup job. We'll tell you why we think that is at stake and some position battles that could be solved by the preseason finale here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Broncos Country, what's up? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks to all the everydayers and the first listeners out there in Broncos Country who tune in to Locked On Broncos every single day. Make sure you subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined as always by Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantly orange.com. And here's what you're going to get on today's brand new episode of the show. As we go through, we're going to look at the Week 3 preseason finale. Before we get into that, there is some concern about Denver's safety depth, according to the Broncos defensive coordinator, Vance Joseph, more so in particular about their key offseason acquisition in Brandon Jones. We'll break down his comments, analyze the outlook of that position, and tell you why we have our concerns there. And on top of that, we'll go through our players to watch here. Sayre picked a few. I picked a few. We're going to tell you why we have them under the microscope in Sunday's game at 2:30 p.m. Mountain Time. And we're going to open things up here with the biggest story of the day being Zach Wilson versus Jarrett Stidham, potentially for the backup quarterback job in this week's preseason finale. Is that going to be the circumstance and the case? All signs point to that. So, without further ado, Sayre, let's break this down here on today's episode of the show. I felt like it's been interesting the last couple of weeks, and obviously, been watching him in practice. Zach Wilson has looked good. He's made some really good plays. Joe Lombardi, following Thursday's practice, gave him a lot of praise. And right now with Bo Nix being named the starting quarterback, all signs kind of point to the fact that, hey, Denver could keep 3 quarterbacks, but who's going to be the backup behind Bo Nix? That's certainly up in the air right now.
Right, because whatever it ends up being or whoever it ends up being is going to be the guy who dresses on game days or the guy that comes in as an injury replacement, whatever. And we obviously know what the backup quarterback's job is, but there's a lot at stake here for Zach Wilson in terms of just kind of his reputation around the league and potentially his future value. I mean, you look at a guy like Sam Darnold, Cody, who parlayed just a year being on Kyle Shanahan's team. He parlayed that into a $10 million deal with the Minnesota Vikings this offseason. So there's a lot at stake for Zach Wilson, and Sean Payton kind of openly acknowledged it. Like, our job is what he said is our job is to make you millions, whether it's here or somewhere else. And I think that is a huge storyline when it comes to this final preseason game. I don't know if the Broncos are playing any games here, Cody, in terms of they've had Jarrett Stidham in the starting competition all offseason, and now he's still taking the second team reps. And I don't know if they're trying to preserve his trade value or if they're trying to just make it look like that in the optics side of things, or maybe they're saying these good things about Zach Wilson to hype up his trade value. I tend to believe that they actually believe what they're saying about Zach, that he's kind of turning a corner a little bit this offseason. And I would guess that if the Broncos only kept 2 quarterbacks, my money today would be on Bo Nix and Zach Wilson.
Yeah, and look, this could go a multitude of ways. And Zach Stevens of DNVR, myself, Nick Kosmider, Parker Gabriel, Eric Lowe, we were kind of sitting there talking at practice during Thursday about like, okay, maybe this is a situation here where like the Broncos did with Albert Okwuegbunam last year in that preseason game where he went out and balled out, and you and I were on the post game saying, hey, Denver needs a tight end like Albert O, and then they trade him. So, there is a possibility this could be a showcase here this weekend between these 2 guys. And I don't know how the rotation is going to work. Sean hasn't gotten into that. I don't know if he's going to tell us fully. He's been very open with us, I think, for the most part, going into preseason games about, hey, this is what phase 1 is going to look like, phase 2. I don't think there's going to be phase 3 of any sorts because we don't expect the starters to play in this game here. So you're going to see Jarrett Stidham. You're going to see Zach Wilson. Who gets the first reps? Great question. How often is the rotation? Is it half and half? Is it quarter? That could also be something. 1 quarter here, 1 quarter there, and then you rotate. There's different things that they can do. Certainly they're not going to tell us today. We'll find out after Friday's practice here for the Broncos. But I do think it is interesting to see maybe how this does play out. And maybe I'll open it up and I'll kind of leave it here with this question, certainly for something Broncos country can sit and think on. Sayre, if you had to, let's look into our crystal ball. Hypothetically, knock on wood, this never happens. Nothing happens to Bo Nix, right? You don't need any of your backups to play this year. But hypothetically speaking, something happens to Bo Nix. Who are you more comfortable playing on Sunday? Who do you think will give the Broncos the best chance to win? Now, I think when you have to look at each QB, you look at the tail of the tape. Jarrett Stidham, I don't think he's reckless with the football at times. He plays it very safe at times. Sometimes that can be a negative detriment to him in terms of how defenses play the Broncos offense with that. But then you have Zach Wilson, who's obviously talented. The talent is there. But also at times he is going to make some of those plays where it's like, you put the ball into harm's way. You can't have that happen. Sean doesn't want that to happen. Who would you be more confident with if something were to happen to Bo in a sense? Who do you think would step up and give Denver the best chance to compete or win games between these two guys?
Well, I think I'm taking Zach Wilson. I think you start with the idea that he's started more games already in the NFL. He's got more starts than obviously either Jarrett Stidham or Bo Nix at this point. So he's got the experience, time on task. And then we've seen in Sean Payton's history, Cody, look what he did with Teddy Bridgewater coming off the injury. Look what he did with Jameis Winston, who was, a 30 interception guy when he left Tampa Bay. He spent some time in Sean Payton's offense, learning the ropes, doing all those sorts of things, and getting back out onto the field. Had his highest touchdown percentage ever, lowest interception percentage ever. So I'm maybe irrationally confident that Zach Wilson could be the best version of himself running Sean Payton's offense. And I think to a degree, you take the high variance because of the talent, right? Because he is, recently the second overall pick in the NFL draft. And especially I think if you had to use a backup for a longer period of time, like you said, we don't ever want that to have to happen here. But if you did, I think Zach is the guy right now who would offer you maybe the highest upside over the course of the long term of the season. Yeah, Jarrett Stidham probably knows the offense quite a bit better at this point. But at the same time, as the season progresses, I just think you want the guy that offers that, the higher ceiling. That's kind of how I roll the dice, Cody. It's go big or go home sort of thing, not necessarily a, hey, let's play it safe and spin our wheels. I think, that reminds me of kind of the strategy with Kyle Orton back in the day, right? I'm not saying Jarrett Stidham is Kyle Orton, but I'm saying that it's kind of just the safe play. It's the guy that you plug in when it's like, all right, we kind of just need some stability here. I think you have the high variance option in Zach Wilson. So go big or go home. Take the guy with the higher ceiling.
Well, we'll leave that. That'll be our Broncos country question of the day here on the show. If you have your thoughts, you want to share what you think on this question here, make sure you send it in to us on social media at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger. If you're watching on YouTube, you can leave your thoughts on that question inside the comments. Look for the prompt there pinned at the top of the YouTube comments there. But certainly something worth investing in. We'll probably find out here after this weekend's game as the Broncos host the Arizona Cardinals for week 3 of the NFL preseason. 2:30 p.m. Mountain Time. You can expect a Locked On Broncos post-game report following that as well, courtesy of Sayre Bedinger, myself. And that's going to set the table really for roster cuts going into, I believe it's next Tuesday, the 27th, if I'm not mistaken. So there's going to be a lot of action, and there's going to be a lot of things that we're going to discuss here on the show. But as we get ready for the Broncos to prepare for this third and final preseason game, there are some players that Sayre and I have our eyes on. I'm looking on the defensive side for the most part. Sayre's looking at the offensive side there. A couple intriguing names here that we'll talk about here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Broncos Country, this show is sponsored by BetterHelp. When your schedule is packed with activities or kids' activities, big work projects, and more, it's easy to let your priorities slip. Even when we know what makes us happy, it's hard to make time for it. But when you feel like you have no time for yourself, non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever. I've utilized BetterHelp therapy in the past to deal with things like stress, anxiety, depression, things like that. Look, my own personal life, there's no playbook for how we go about and how we deal with things that life throws our way, but we can learn things. We can find solutions within ourselves that will help make things a little bit more manageable. That's the benefit I got from BetterHelp. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient and, best of all, flexible and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist And you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge if you and your therapist don't mesh well. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon.
Roster spots are up for grabs as the Denver Broncos enter the final week of the preseason against the Arizona Cardinals. Which guys on offense, defense, and special teams are going to be taking these roster spots that may be available? Cody and I are going to break down some names, including Jalen Virgil, Keidron Smith, and more on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. I want to say thank you to every single one of you everydayers out there that makes Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. Every single day, you know your boys, Cody and Sayre, your friends. We're going to be here with you every single day to talk about the team that you love. You don't want to miss anything that happens with the Denver Broncos. You hit subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. We appreciate all of you so much. And for your second listen, go check out Locked On NFL. Get educated on the different goings on elsewhere around the league as we prepare for week 1 of the 2024 season. A lot of really good matchups coming up, Cody. A lot of great discussion to be had, including this final week of the preseason here. We can't overlook the final week of the preseason. It's always fun to watch Denver Broncos football, but there's so much at stake, even though the wins and losses of the preseason, they don't matter. There's roster spots at stake, practice squad spots at stake. There's a lot going on here. Let's get into our players to watch for this particular game and highlight some guys on, well, I know you teased it. You're going to be focusing more on the defensive side of the ball. I have guys on the offensive side of the ball that I'm kind of looking at, but I want to throw it to you here, Cody. Who do you have your eye on in this game for the Denver Broncos against the Cardinals?
Well, I've got 3 of them listed up here on the show in terms of who I'm going to highlight. You mentioned Keidron Smith. He's obviously a name that we'll bring up here in a minute, but I think we have to take a look at, considering what I thought to be interesting from Vance Joseph and his comments following Thursday's practice, really about some of the position battles, you want to get clarity on. He mentioned cornerback, right? So it's like, okay, does this mean that Riley Moss and Damarri Mathis are both going to play in this game? Because Vance said we're going to need a lot of corners this upcoming season. So I think when you look at players to watch here, I've got Damarri Mathis, Riley Moss as 2 players there. We'll obviously bring up Keidron Smith here as a chance to lock up maybe a spot at the safety position, make the argument. I was talking with several people at practice. Has he pushed J.L. Skinner off the depth chart or, behind a spot on the depth chart? That I think is very intriguing to me. And then I went with an offensive player as well, also kind of offense special teams. I like Nate Adkins. I want to highlight him because I think he's also a player. When we look at tight end, we look at all these positions here that Denver has in terms of making roster decisions. Special teams is going to have to factor into that quite a bit. I think Nate Adkins has had a terrific offseason, a terrific training camp and preseason so far as a special teams player. He's also doing some things on the offensive side of the ball that are exciting. And I do think he's going to be a roster lock, but you want to see him go out here in this game and prove it. And obviously with Damarri and Riley, I want to see these guys battle here for that corner spot to see who's going to be the starter week 1 against the Seattle Seahawks. But we all know these guys are going to be relied upon no matter what. Your thoughts on that, and then we'll jump into yours.
Yeah, I do love the picks of the cornerbacks there. I know the Arizona Cardinals are going to be starting Clayton Tune in this game. Not sure if it's going to be a showcase of Clayton Tune for their coaching staff or whatnot, but you hope that Riley Moss, Damarri Mathis, should they be playing in this game, which we expect they will be, you hope that those guys can make some plays on the football against Clayton Tune. I mean, Clayton Tune is not Tom Brady out there necessarily picking apart the defense. I think you're going to have opportunities to go make plays on the football. And so somebody's got to do that, right? I mean, Keidron Smith has the only interceptions of the preseason right now, as far as I can recall off the top of my head. So let's see a corner, one of these 2 guys specifically, Riley Moss, Damarri Mathis, go out there and get one. I love the pick of Nate Adkins as well. He's probably one of the better blockers the Broncos have offensively, not on the offensive line, right? So I think he's going to be able to potentially carve out a roster spot for himself in this game, not just offensively, but on special teams. Interesting to kind of think about, and maybe the listeners can let us know what they think. Do you think Nate Adkins has more to prove in terms of what he brings to the offense or what he brings to the special teams in order to make this team? Because ultimately, I think that there's a fair argument to be made on either side.
Yeah, no, that's a great question too, and we'll leave that obviously with the fan. I think what he's done on special teams has been great. especially with his body type in the kickoff game, the kick return game, in terms of setting things up as a blocker. It's also helping him maybe refine some areas of his game that he can use on the offensive side. Because what do we see in that first preseason game? We saw the quarterback design run with Bo Nix, but it was Nate Adkins being the lead blocker there on that. I like that play. And look, there is Mike Burton there, but I think you add like Nate Adkins to the mix here. You keep an additional tight end. He can do a little bit of everything. He is that hybrid, that H back here that Denver does have in the offense. I do think Sean Payton likes Nate Adkins quite a bit. I think his roster spot will be safe, but I do think that right now he's going to bring more value immediately to special teams. And Ben Kotrika had mentioned as well, he and Mike Westhoff and Chris Banjo, those guys, they get a vote in those meeting rooms about, hey, like roster wise, where we're at as they're building the 53-man roster, where it's going to come to, really terms on Tuesday. You go from 90 players to 53. It's a widespread move there. I'm very curious to see how it all plays out here. But Sayre, I want to throw it to you now. When you're looking at your players that you want to watch, your UTs earlier, you're going to really focus on the offensive side of the ball. As we talked about in the previous segment, we're really focused on, okay, hey, Jarrett Stidham, Zach Wilson, who's going to compete? Who's going to win that backup quarterback job right now? Well, these wide receivers that you bring up here, offensive players, they're definitely going to have a little bit of a role to be had.
They are. And I want to start with Troy Franklin, who I think there's not really a roster conversation to be had there. In my opinion, I think Troy Franklin is going to be on this 53-man roster, despite the fact that I know we get comments. I see things on Twitter about, well, Troy hasn't done anything, in the games, and other receivers have. And look, the Broncos invested in this guy. They traded up to get him. They have a second round grade on him. He's not going to get cut barring something shocking or, just altogether very surprising that would happen here in the next week. I expect him to make the roster, but I do want to see him ball out in the preseason game against the Cardinals. Like, the receivers just haven't been getting involved. So, and we've talked about that earlier this week on the show. It's just, you need to see the receivers getting involved and active, because that's one of those position groups where at the bottom of the depth chart right now, you're really trying to sort things out. And so I think that's going to be critical for this game. Jalen Virgil is another guy that, man, you want to see the opportunities on special teams there for him. You want to see him get those chances as a kickoff returner. We saw 3 opportunities in the first week of the preseason. Maybe the Broncos have seen enough when it comes to Jalen Virgil. I don't know, but I really would love to see just as much of him as we possibly can, especially being that, this game against the Cardinals could be his last game as a Denver Bronco, depending on what happens with the roster situation. So we'll have to wait and see. And my final guy was Tyler Beatty. The guy seems to just make a big play every other time, or every time he touches the ball, right? He's outstanding when it comes to his speed and vision. Can he do enough on special teams in order to earn a 53-man roster spot? Because the Broncos have a loaded running back room right now. They have defined and solidified roles amongst that running back room. Now, Tyler Beatty's going to have to do something pretty special to make this team, but I think he's one of those guys that would be on the cusp for me.
No, and he's had a great offseason, great preseason. You mentioned the defined roles there. Javonte Williams, Jaleel McLaughlin, Audric Estime. Those guys have defined their roles for this upcoming season. So Deshaun carry 3? Does he carry 4? How does that work? So the special teams aspect is going to be big there. Audric Estime is also going to have to play special teams. He's going to be that third running back here for Denver. Jaleel, I think, loves to play special teams as well. So that's a nice, little bit of a wrinkle to throw in there. Troy Franklin, not only I think you're going to see a ton of him in this week's game, I also think you're going to see a lot of him also on special teams. I think he had 5 snaps on special teams this past week. If I'm not mistaken, I think he had a tackle on kickoff and came off the field. Pretty excited about that. So, it's different than what he's been accustomed to, catching touchdown passes at the University of Oregon, to now it's like, now I'm tackling people at the NFL level playing kickoff of all things. He didn't do that at Oregon. So it's good to maybe see him kind of gain a little bit of confidence, because this has been really a quiet offseason for him. And Denver's just got him in a position right now where he's going to really continue to develop. Jalen Virgil, I think you and I both agree, we know what we're getting when we look at a guy like Virgil, a core 4 special teams player who can excel as a jammer, can excel as a gunner, and also is going to be a return option for you. In my opinion there, if it's going to be, you need someone opposite of Marvin Mims, I would much rather have Jalen Virgil there than Jaleel McLaughlin. I'd rather save Jaleel for the run game, because you never know. You may need to call upon him early on, depending on circumstances. And so protect those guys in those regards. The guys that you mentioned, I think, have a great opportunity to contribute. Not only just like, you talked about it, I think, in yesterday's show, Troy Franklin, may redshirt a lot of this year, but let's say, hey, midway through the season, something happens, or he's ready. He's shown it in practice, and the team's like, all right, hey, we're going to activate you for this game. That's certainly a possibility of what we can see, depending on matchups, depending on personnel and how that looks. So I'm very curious as well. These are some great players to identify. And look, Broncos Country, we always want to hear from you. Who are your players that you have your eye on in Sunday's preseason finale? Make sure you let us know here, wherever you're listening or watching Locked On Broncos. We are going to get into something else that has nothing really to do with the preseason as we transition to a little bit of a focus on the regular season, because it is coming up here. Broncos defensive coordinator Vance Joseph expressed some concern about Brandon Jones, obviously, in guys missing time at practice due to injury. How might that impact their plans defensively? We'll tell you what that looks like here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Broncos Country, today's episode of the show is brought to you by our friends over there at LinkedIn Jobs. And when you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. And that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs, because LinkedIn Jobs, they have the tools that will help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just a job board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals that you can't find anywhere else, even those who might not actively be searching for a new job, but they might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. And on LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses, they get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. So hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. For Broncos defensive coordinator Vance Joseph, he's expressed some concern about Brandon Jones, the hamstring injury he suffered early on at training camp, and how long it has held him out of practice for a variety of circumstances that definitely present some question marks going into that week 1 game against the Seattle Seahawks, who we all know have terrific wide receivers like DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett. You got Bobo out of there. You got Jackson Smith and Jigba, Noah Fant at tight end. There is a potential storm brewing there, at least on paper, where it's like, hey, this is a big concern going into week 1. We'll highlight that here on today's episode. Lockdown Broncos. Real quick, I want to say thanks to all the everydayers and the first listeners out there in Broncos Country. Thanks for making the show exactly what it is. Sayre, we caught up with Broncos defensive coordinator Vance Joseph after practice, and he was asked a question, initially about, are you concerned that Brandon Jones, hasn't been on the field? And obviously he signed in free agency, 3-year deal, and it's going to be the starter next to PJ Locke. But first week of training camp, he hurt his hamstring and has not been on the field. I mean, Sayre, we're going on 3 or 4 weeks here of him not being on the field, actually taking reps at the position. I know the goal is to get him to the regular season, but without that work, that's a little bit of a concern, and Vance Joseph agrees.
It was not comforting to hear what Vance Joseph had to say after practice on Thursday, Cody, when he was asked about this in particular. Like, specifically, he was asked, are you concerned about Brandon Jones missing a bunch of time? He basically was just like, yeah, anytime a player misses this much on-field work, it's concerning, right? And I think that is the case, that we've all been kind of thinking this in terms of how the offseason has progressed. He not only has missed most of training camp, he's missed the preseason. He also missed OTAs, a lot of OTAs, not the entirety of OTAs, but he was out at OTAs as well. So Cody, my thoughts on this. A lot of the everydayers know my thoughts on this, but for anybody that hasn't heard my thoughts on this, and I think you agree with me, it's kind of ridiculous that the Broncos have approached this position the way that they have. I mean, I fully on board for going with the youth movement all over this roster. Love it. Love the strategy from Sean Payton. Love that you're buying into guys like Devin Key, who's worked really hard to get that spot. But it's roster malpractice, in my opinion, to go into a season when you saw last year without Justin Simmons what life looks like without that guy on the back end of your defense. And conversely, what it's like when he came back. You saw that firsthand. 70 points given up in one game. I know that that's kind of an outlier when it comes to NFL history, not just the Broncos, but Justin was sitting out there in free agency all summer long, all offseason. He's been sitting out there, finally signs a 1-year deal with the Falcons that's worth about, $3.5 million more than the dead money charge that he's got on the Denver Broncos salary cap. So I don't like it. it doesn't sit right with me. This is the deepest free agent safety class I've ever seen. The Broncos signed the one dude that hasn't been out there at practice to a contract that's barely worth it's barely worth less on an average annual salary than Justin Simmons just got from the Falcons. It's not that I don't like Brandon Jones. It's not that I don't think he could be an effective starter, because I think we both do. But I'm a little upset about the way this has been handled, especially hearing what Vance Joseph had to say.
Well, and on top of that, too, the team released Caden Stearns, who we all know can play, like when healthy, can play. Now he's reunited with Vic Fangio and Christian Parker with the Philadelphia Eagles. And as you mentioned, Justin's in Atlanta. And look, it's a gamble. I would say that their approach with the safety position this offseason was a huge gamble. We understand that they had to release Justin because of the Russell Wilson dead cap, the contract, and everything along the lines. We understand that. But if Justin signed for $8 million with the Falcons, we're sitting here as like, why couldn't Denver do that this year? And look, maybe they open the door next year for Justin to return. Certainly a possibility, but that's not going to help the Broncos in 2024, especially if, like, for example, let's say Brandon Jones, is ready to go week 1. He hasn't had, as Vance Joseph said, a lot of time on task at the position, because not only for Brandon is it a new scheme, it's new terminology, it's new language that you have to understand. And Vance made a very, very distinct statement about, like, being on the practice field is a lot different than being in the meeting room. Like, you can be in the meeting room, but practicing is where it matters, right? We talk about mental reps all the time. When I coached my injured players, when I was coaching, that's one thing we talked about, mental reps. And surely it's like, hey, I know you can't be on the field doing stuff right now. Mental rep, mental rep, mental rep. But it's different, though. It's like now when you're back in the process of being able to be on the field, now you have to do the things that you were taking mental reps on, and there can't be any delay, especially if you're a starter coming back from injury. So this is also something, let's say he goes out there week 1. We've seen it with Greg Dulcich. Hamstring soft tissues, they can be tricky. You can make great progress. You can make 6 to 7 weeks of recovery time and feel great. One wrong movement sets you back another 6 to 7 weeks. Huge, huge gamble here by Denver. And look, I'm excited to see a little bit more of Devin Key. I think Keydron Smith has made a little bit of a name for himself in the preseason, maybe jumping over JL Skinner on the depth chart. But at the end of the day, the number one thing that matters is that, hey, next to PJ Locke, you had an opportunity to either keep Caden Stearns or you had an opportunity to bring back Justin Simmons, even though you went out and signed this guy in free agency. But now you don't get to see this guy play because of injuries. That, I think, impacts the perception of the defense. And I think that's probably the one area right now on this entire team that has the biggest question mark.
It is. And I think if the Broncos do go out and sign a veteran free agent, how much of a slap in the face is that going to feel like to the fan base that's been sitting out here watching Justin Simmons sit in free agency? Even Fanatics thought the dude was coming back. They printed all of his jerseys and are having to sell them for 70% off or something ridiculous like that. But look, I don't get it. I don't get the idea here. Protecting your investments is always a smart thing to do. When you have PJ Locke, who we all love PJ Locke, the dude has missed quite a bit of time, though, due to injury. And I think that it's fair to say that, because you're going into a season where the youth movement is on big time, full force. The youth movement is on. If you end up needing a veteran presence at the safety position at any point, man, it is going to be frustrating to say the least. And now you're left kind of looking at, all right, who's left out there? And I'm not saying the Broncos are, but you're now also having to prevent yourself from another Frank Clark situation where you go out and you, in desperation mode, you sign a veteran, ends up being a horrible fit for the locker room that you've constructed. And I just, you had a guy that's been there already, a guy who's a huge asset to the team, to the city of Denver, things like that. And so I'm not gonna beat that dead horse all year. We did that last year, and with Alberto Cuebanam. And I think that it's just, if it comes up again, it comes up again, because that's the situation that presented itself. So I'm sure a lot of others in Broncos country are kind of fuming over this after hearing Vance Joseph. I wouldn't have thought any of this stuff, Cody. I still would have loved to seen the Broncos bring Justin back regardless, but I wouldn't be this upset if Vance hadn't come out and said the stuff that he did today, which makes me worried about that position even more.
Yeah, part of me is also thinking too, like when Vance said that, what was Sean thinking? Like when Sean hears that, is there a conversation that's going to be had later? Because Ideally, Sean doesn't want there to be any kind of like negative paintings about maybe the direction or the perception of the team. And certainly, it's like, yeah, it is a concern. And I think what Vance said is valid. But for Brandon, I think it's a little bit more specific because it is a new system, it is a new scheme. It's different than the cornerback position. Corner, you can adjust on a lot of things. He mentioned that about Levi Wallace. Thing is, like, I've seen Levi Wallace out practicing. He was out there during Thursday's practice, actually getting reps at cornerback, working into the thing because he's probably gonna have to play and do something well to make this roster here. But he said, I'm not as worried about a guy like him because he's a veteran. He's played a lot of football. Safety's different. And Brandon hasn't had that experience in terms of just like, this is a new scheme, new terminology. All that stuff is a difference maker when it comes to this defense specifically. So a lot of interesting things to, kind of play itself out here. And obviously we'll see. Our hope is that Brandon can be ready for week 1 of the regular season. He stays healthy. And all of a sudden we're sitting here like, all right, hey, Denver dodged one there because that could have been scary here. But right now, I think it is valid to have a little bit of skepticism about that. It is a risk. It is a gamble. And hopefully it doesn't come back to bite the Broncos in the rear end in the negative way. But with that said, Broncos Country, that'll wrap up today's episode of the show here on the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. Thanks to all the everydayers and first listeners out there for coming through. As always, here in Broncos Country, you make the show exactly what it is. And if you're a brand new listener or viewer of the show and you loved everything that we had, we just want to say thanks for giving us a shot here. Stick with us because we have daily Broncos news, content, coverage, analysis, and more, plus a post-game report every time the Broncos play on Sundays. You get that coverage here. You don't get it anywhere else. Locked On Broncos. For your second listen today, make sure you go check out the Locked On NFL podcast to figure out what's going on around the rest of the National Football League. You got contract extensions, AJ Terrell getting the bag with the Atlanta Falcons. What does that mean now for Patrick Surtain as he's next up on the clock for a big payday? They'd probably debate and discuss that. Locked On NFL. We'll see you next time for another episode of the show.